Hello, and welcome to the episode of Young Heretics in which I explain literally the entire world to you. That is almost not a joke. It's kind of a joke because obviously I can't explain the whole world to you in an hour, but I want to either introduce you to, or if you're already familiar with it, I want to explore with you a concept that is so central to the history of human intellectual endeavor that it has been used to explain almost everything from the crucifixion to internet memes. And this is, I actually think it's a really powerful tool, a powerful intellectual tool. It's fallen, I would say, a little bit out of favor in the general public. It's not something that, most academics will tell you they know all about this, but the concept of mimesis is a concept that, again, it's just, it's something that kind of grasps at a huge amount of what we've been talking about. And it helps us, I think, to answer a really important question, or at least to point something out that corrects a really important mistake in modern thinking, which is that we do not create ourselves. That's going to be my argument throughout this entire thing. You are not a fully self-determined, self-generated being, despite the fact that you have free choice, despite the fact that you are able to shape yourself in good and bad ways and be shaped by others. You do not have 100% 360-degree choice over the kind of being that you are. And mimesis is going to be my route into making that case to you. And on the way, I hope that I will explain the crucifixion and memes and all that other stuff. So, okay, the thing about, because the thing about words, right, is that they exist kind of as these rude tools that we use to outline the shape of the universe. And some things, like tables, have, concrete physical outlines, but the other things like love also have contours, and that you can't see them or touch them, but we know that they're there. We know that love has a huge range of meanings and shades of meaning, and for many societies and civilizations, such as the ancient Greeks, right, there were many words to pick each of those out. And that's an important feature of all this, right? The universe, or the reality of the universe, is infinite and infinitely varied, and we use words basically to take little snapshots or to just, grasp some element of these sometimes quite ineffable things in reality and characteristics. So, for example, when I see a man giving his lunch to a homeless person, I call that love. And when I see a man and wife getting married, I call that love, even though there's two materially completely different circumstances. But when I see somebody murdered in cold blood, for example, I do not call that love. And so there are these, these things are flexible, but not infinitely. And with words, basically what we do is we carve out these little patches of reality. Now, one of the things that learning foreign languages can help you to do is to understand that those little spaces that you carve out with words are not themselves rooted in and forever immutable in the structure of the universe. And you kind of, when you only speak one language, you kind of think that they are. And I'll give you a really easy example, right? The English word and, which is a conjunction, right, joins two things together, is often translated in ancient Greek by the Greek word de. But de also means what we mean by the English word but. And so to have a word that means both of those things shows you that there's actually some overlap, even though but carves out this space in English and carves out this space in English. There's this weird overlap in which the Greek word de exists. And you can illustrate that by saying something like, for example, I got your letter and I really enjoyed it. And I also want to talk to you about it, because those two ands are different, right? The first and I really enjoyed it. These two things go together. And then there's kind of this transition of like, but I have, and the tone of my voice tells you how it's different. All of this is simply by way of saying, learning other languages shows you ways in which words don't actually, adhere themselves in reality. They describe things that exist in reality. However, some words are such powerful tools and hit the nail so rightly on the head that we keep them around and we use them even when, we don't speak the language anymore and we just need something to describe this ubiquitous phenomenon that has no other term. And this is why philosophers are always making up words, because they're trying to feel their way like blind men in the dark for these outlines of realities. And mimesis is one of those words. It's a philosophical term that was invented essentially to describe this pattern of human behavior, and I'm going to argue of cosmological significance and truth, that really we can't describe in any other way. It comes from a Greek verb, mimeomai, and the infinitive of that is mimēsis, and it means to imitate, right, or to reproduce or to copy. Initially, in its earliest forms, it seems basically to mean, to imitate, to give back to somebody. Somebody talks a certain way, you imitate them. That's mimeomai. But it has this other sort of simultaneously developing philosophical meaning, and that's the meaning that I want to talk about today. And I'm going to argue that mimesis, or mimesis is the way you pronounce it in Greek, but I'm going to say mimesis as sort of the English way of pronouncing it. Mimesis is a sort of fundamental patterning of the universe that is reproduced and imitated and re-expressed in ourselves as well. That's what we're getting into today. Before we do, thank you for coming with me on this journey to talk about such obscure and fascinating things as mimesis. I'm very grateful that you're all out there listening and watching. If you have not already, if this is your first time, welcome, and please subscribe. You will get a new episode every week if you just hit the subscribe button wherever you are right now, wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, whatever, YouTube. And if you like the show, we would really appreciate it. It would help us a lot if you could give it a 5-star review. A lot of times people, I think, enjoy the show and they're thinking good things about it, but they just don't take the time to go and write it. I get that. I myself can be hugely lazy about that sort of thing. But if you don't mind, please take the time to write. It means a huge amount to us when you leave a 5-star review. Thank you for being here. Now, let's talk about mimesis, and let's start with Aristotle. Even though Aristotle is not the first person to invent this term, he's somebody, I think, who has a very cut and dry and straightforward way of talking about things, and famous last words, of course, because he's very complicated. But in general, he's sort of down to earth, or tries to be, and he's the great student of Plato, who was himself the greatest student of Socrates. So just as a brief refresher about the tradition of Greek philosophical thought, which then becomes the tradition of Western philosophical thought, right? Socrates himself wanders about, never writes anything down, amasses a cadre of friends and students about him, whom he does not charge, but whom he challenges basically on every level. And that this relationship, this warm, powerful, intimate friendship between him and his students is generative of all of this insight and wisdom. And then they kill him, and then he's murdered by the Athenian state. And Plato goes on to found his academy, and then Aristotle is the student of Plato who studies at the academy, and then after many travels and in some cases travails, he founds, at the age of 50, he founds the Lyceum. The Lyceum is named after Apollo Lyceus, and he founds it in 334 BC. He and his students, it's open to the public, he and his students walk together in the cloister, which is called the peripatos, and they become what is called peripatetics. That's the tradition that goes on from Aristotle. But this is the guy who, Aristotle is in the Lyceum in this period writing most of his great works, many of which are sort of notes and transcripts from his lectures that he was giving and his lessons that he was giving. And he had a fascination with everything, right? And he had a kind of a unifying field theory of everything, although he wouldn't perhaps have put it quite that way. He has this obsession with origins and with goals and final ends. So the telos, the end, and the phusis, which is the nature and the natural growing of a thing. And he frames almost everything in that way. It's a very powerful intellectual tool. And in the Poetics, which is his book about tragedy, it's the first great work of literary criticism. There was a bit about comedy too, and that was lost. We've talked about it before, but now I want to kind of get at, in some senses, the heart of its theory of poetry. Now, he's talking here about poiesis, which is another Greek word, and it gets at some of what I've been arguing about, what art is, right? Poiesis literally just means making. And then you have the techne poietike, which is the craft or the skill of making. And then we get in the symposium, but also elsewhere, we're told and we're shown that there's a specific meaning of poiesis, which applies specifically to something closer to, but not exactly the same as, what we would now call poetry. And that's what Aristotle is defining here. He's saying, what is poiesis in the artistic sense? Well, it's mimesis. It's mimesis in the medium of logos rhythmos and harmonia. Logos being language, verbal speech, verbal utterance, rhythmos being rhythmically structured time, right, rhythm, and harmonia being not just harmony, but melody too, tones arranged in a pretty pattern. And you can do that either together or separately. So you can have wordless music, instrumental music, and that qualifies as poiesis for Aristotle. So he's talking about a broader thing than just, what we think of like Keats and Tennyson and these guys, right? He's talking more about music and poetry and poetry set to music, and these things are all kind of wrapped up. Again, remember these words that cut things into sections, you get different sections cut in different languages. And so poiesis is a very useful term for understanding kind of what we talk about when we talk about all forms of auditory art. Every kind of art that you listen to, right, is what Aristotle is talking about here. And all of it, he says, is mimesis. It's all either imitation or representation. And there are these nuances in how we understand what this means, right? Are we talking purely about reproduction? Well, no, because as we're told, for example, in some Platonic dialogues, like in the Cratylus, that if you reproduce something, you're not doing mimesis at all. There has to be some kind of space between, well, I'm taking this thing and I'm remaking it elsewhere. I'm taking this physical human body, which is here in flesh and blood, and I'm remaking it in miniature out of clay or whatever, right? And so there's this element of kind of reproduction, but in a different way that communicates something, right? That conveys the thing that you are imitating or reproducing. And so that's basically what Aristotle is kind of defining poetry, and more broadly poiesis. And I think really, this is an artistic theory. It's a holistic theory of what art is. This is how he's defining it in the Poetics. Now, where does he get this idea that it's a mimesis? I mean, it's staggeringly, again, it's a powerful concept, right? And it explains a lot of what we do when we do art, right? That we take this thing, this reality, this inner experience, or this experience that we have of a vista or whatever, and we frame it and we create it in some new medium, right? And we imitate or reproduce it. And importantly, right, our audience responds when you make a mimesis. Your audience responds with its own corresponding mimesis. So the ideal is, I have this experience, I reproduce the thing that generates that experience, and then the person who sees it also kind of now shares or has conveyed to him or her that inner life. Where does all this come from? Well, in part, it comes from his obsession with origins, right? And so he tells this story about how poetry begins. And I'm going to use poetry here to translate poiesis, even though, as I've said, it's bigger than that. So poetry in general seems to have sprung from two causes, each of them lying deep in our nature. First, the instinct of imitation is implanted in man from childhood. One difference between him and other animals being that he is the most imitative of living creatures, and through imitation learns his earliest lessons, and no less universal is the pleasure felt in things imitated. We have evidence of this in the facts of experience. Objects which in themselves we view with pain, we delight to contemplate when reproduced with minute fidelity, such as the forms of the most ignoble animals and of dead bodies. This is a staggering insight, and if you pass over it too quickly, it's because it's something that has become kind of integrated into our collective experience and thought world. But imagine it as a kind of unique observation that we enjoy seeing things in imitation that we would not enjoy seeing in real life. And I think this is connected to something Aristotle says elsewhere, which is in the Metaphysics. He says that man by nature reaches out to know. And so to see something delivered to us, even though the thing itself is bad and painful, activates this deeply natural human impulse we have to imitate and to experience imitation. He notes, Aristotle does, that we do it in play, we do it in lessons. This is an observation really about human nature, about physis is the Greek word, and physis, which is something else that Aristotle defines, right, is the thing that it happens spontaneously. It has its principle of change and being at rest within itself. So it's just the thing that if you leave human beings to kind of form societies, they do mimesis, they do imitation. And that instinct developed is what creates art. Now, as a philosophical observation, this is brilliant in two ways. As a historical observation, I should note, it's not probably that accurate as a description of how Greek tragedy evolved. And if you want to read an interesting sort of set of arguments about how little Aristotle knew about the history of tragedy, my old teacher, Scott Scullion, has a great essay called Nothing to Do with Dionysus that you can look up. And that's, you know, this is not really a text that we look to, at least in its particulars. It's not really a text that we look to know exactly how tragedy evolved. But as a philosophical observation, it's brilliant, right? First of all, it recognizes something fundamental about poetry and what art is. And second of all, it recognizes something fundamental about what we are, right? We are imitating beings, and art is our, in some senses, our highest act of imitation. And this kind of broader view of mimesis as the human thing, and as the way that the universe is on some level structured, this is something he gets from Plato, who is in fact really the inventor of the theory of mimesis as such, or perhaps theories, right? Because as we're going to get to, there's like a lot of complexity here in all the different dialogues. So Plato, Aristotle's teacher, remember, right? His academy, more restricted than the Lyceum, and that's where Aristotle kind of cuts his teeth. This is in the 300s BC, and he's using the dialogue form to capture what it was like to be with and learn from Socrates. And it's in the 360s that Aristotle shows up here, and he stays for 20 years, but Plato himself has a much longer career. Now, famously, Plato is kind of impossible to pin down on mimesis. There's a ton of different statements about it, and we will be, in some senses, taking a big lay of the land here, rather than, spending all of our time on one Platonic dialogue. And the reason for that is that I believe, broadly speaking, that you can understand Plato as working out a coherent theory, a grand theory of mimesis, even though he talks about it in different ways in each different dialogue. And so in order to make that case, and in order to kind of explore more fully what this idea is, I'm going to start with a dialogue that is now kind of underappreciated that Plato composes. Essentially, it presents itself as a sequel to the Republic, which is that's the big one, right? That's the one about what is justice and what's the ideal political setup. The Timaeus is supposed to take place basically the day after that. And the speaker is not Socrates, but Timaeus, and he describes essentially the creation of the physical universe, the whole cosmos, the whole shebang. And he posits it as having been created by the demiurge, the demiurgos, which is a Greek word meaning craftsman. And the universe, as we've talked about, I talked about a little bit about this on the Christmas episode as a Stoic idea, but this is, predating some of that Stoic philosophy, at least some of the Roman Stoic philosophy that we talked about. This idea that the universe has a soul and a body. And so that's a big one. And let's get into it a little bit, right? The demiurge creates a soul for the universe. And when, Timaeus says, this is Timaeus 36, when the construction of the soul had been completed to the satisfaction of its constructor, then he fabricated within it all the corporeal, and uniting them center to center, he made them fit together. And the soul, being woven throughout heaven, every way from the center to the extremity, and enveloping it in a circle from without, and herself revolving within herself, began a divine beginning of unceasing and intelligent life, lasting throughout all time. And whereas the body of heaven is visible, the soul is herself invisible, but partakes in reasoning and in harmony, having come into existence by the agency of the best of things intelligible and ever existing as the best of things generated. So there's a lot there, and be warned if you embark upon the Timaeus that it is mystical in this way, and it takes multiple readings despite being relatively short. However, having subjected it myself to multiple readings on your behalf, I think that what is being said here is essentially that the soul is not only immanent in all of creation, but is itself fashioned. It is the medium within which all physical stuff is fashioned. And the soul permeates that and gives meaning and order to it. And this, I'm going on now to read, right? Whenever she touches anything which has its substance dispersed, or anything which has its substance undivided, she is moved throughout her whole being and announces what the object is identical with, and from what it is different, and in what relation, where, and how, and when it comes about that each thing exists and is acted upon by others, both in the sphere of the becoming and in that of the ever uniform. Now, this is all a bit abstract, but again, what's being represented here, and note that in other dialogues, Plato is quite explicit about the metaphorical nature of his cosmic parables and his myths and his stories, right? He is not naive about what these are. These are inexact and sort of representative descriptions of things that human beings have no direct access to. But he's talking about the animating principle of the universe, and he's saying that it speaks, that it has intelligence, and through the realm of the physical world, it kind of communicates to our minds the shape and form of things. So instead of just seeing splotches of green and brown, we see trees, right? There's this idea that, it communicates the things that are the same as each other and the things that are different from each other. And her announcement, being identically true concerning both the other and the same, is born through the self-moved, without speech or sound. So without speech or sound is important, right? This is a pronouncement that we don't hear audibly. It's not a physical pronouncement, but that our minds are attuned to, and we're able, by perceiving the world, we're able to hear, as it were, the announcement, the proclamation of the world soul. He's basically developing here a theory for why it is that we are able to know anything, which, you think about it, is kind of weird, right? That we go about in the world and we actually are able to identify things like, count numbers, right? 1 and 2, these ideas that seem to describe the universe and can be used to predict things about the universe. He's saying this is because we actually have some connection to the entirety of the structure of the universe. And that connection is like a kind of communication. And even though, again, this is an inexact metaphor, nevertheless, we're kind of describing here what it is that there is knowledge at all. And it's like a little kind of mimesis, because our souls then are crafted in the same way that the world soul is, and they give shape and order to our bodies in the same way that the world soul gives shape and order to the whole physical universe. So and this is something that Stephen Hallowell, whose book is really good on this, The Aesthetics of Mimesis, 2002, he says, Timaeus basically projects mimesis, relations of mimesis, onto the whole cosmos, because our one human person is basically this little miniature reproduction of the whole structure of the universe, which has both mind, that is governing principles and logic and reason that are intangible, and then the physical stuff, right? Our bodies also, in which our mind is expressed and through which we proclaim the inner workings of our minds. And music, note, right, is important here. The word harmonia, which I translated earlier as melody or music, right, is from a verb about joining, harmosdo, joining things together. And the reason that music is so powerful and important is because it itself creates a little mimesis of the motions of the heavens. So this idea that music kind of taps into this ineffable reality that we're all operating with this stuff. It sounds really airy-fairy and abstract, but in reality, it's the most basic form of the universe that we engage with every day. The fact that we know there's one coffee cup on the table instead of 2, right? That's the kind of thing we're talking about. And the idea is that music, which nobody can quite, throughout history, nobody has ever been able really to put their finger on why music moves us in the way that it does. But part of the idea is that these motions that music goes through, the up and down of the scale and the harmonies and the rhythms, right? These things are like this kind of ingrained and thing that we respond to because they mimic, they are mimetic of this big, large pattern that governs the wheeling of the stars and everything. Again, if this all sounds like mumbo jumbo, just note that, of course, now neurobiologists are studying music in exactly this way. And you can look up studies that show that, the different wavelengths of different musical patterns will correspond to, different brain wavelengths. And, we respond, of course, to, it's a little more complicated than this, I will grant, but we respond essentially to mathematical proportion in music as well. And so number, music, cosmic reality, all of these things in Plato's Timaeus are mapped onto one another. You have this big universal structure that is then shrunk in microcosm into our souls, and our souls both kind of produce, but also respond to other little microcosms that we make of certain smaller parts of that experience. And that's what art is. Now, precisely because it is this, precisely because music and art more generally reproduces these very visceral, very deep and primitive primal aspects of just what we are, it is very, very powerful. And precisely because it has this power, music and poetry can also be used for very pernicious purposes. And this is where we get the famous, for some people, very concerning, and in some cases even some people find it very authoritarian, right? This critique of the poets in the Republic. And in the Republic, of course, the poets are eventually exiled from the ideal city. And the reason for that is not that Plato doesn't like them, or he's a Philistine or whatever. In fact, he has Socrates say, I love Homer. I wish I didn't have to exile him. And this kind of coy, right? I wish I didn't, I've been nurtured on all of this great Greek poetry, but I have to kick it out because it's simply too volatile. It's too dangerous. So here's from Plato, Republic 10. Here's his argument about why he's kicking the poets out. He says, this is Socrates speaking, the character Socrates. Does a couch differ from itself according as you view it from the side or the front or in any other way? Or does it differ not at all, in fact, though it appears different, and so of other things? That is the way of it, he said. It appears other, but differs not at all. Consider then, says Socrates, this very point. To which is painting directed in every case? To the imitation of reality as it is, or of appearance as it appears? Is it an imitation of a phantasm or of the truth? Of a phantasm, he responded. Then the mimetic art is far removed from truth. And this, it seems, is the reason why it can produce everything, because it touches or lays hold of only a small part of the object, and that a phantom. As, for example, a painter, we say, will paint us a cobbler, a carpenter, a craftsman, though he himself has no expertness in any of these arts. But nevertheless, if he were a good painter, by exhibiting at a distance his picture of a carpenter, he would deceive children and foolish men and make them believe it to be a real carpenter. So this is kind of a subtle argument. Every time you try to grab hold of it, it kind of twists a different way. So basically, Plato thinks that all creation is a mimesis of these, of these higher truths, right? That all tables are a mimesis of the form of the table, and that all, human love is just partaking in this grand form of desire. Well, actually, human love aims us toward this grand form of the beautiful, and so, we're already at a place where we're kind of at one remove from reality, and then art, especially visual art in this passage, but just, artistic representation in general, is deceptive because it basically represents the representation, the thing that we have an experience of. And to be fair, right, this is a decent description of art, right? That we go about having this, interior experience of something that is beyond our material world, and then we kind of put the material experience into matter. Now, it leaves out, in my view, and I think it does so somewhat coyly, it leaves out the fact that you can, in fact, enshrine these ineffable experiences within the material reproduction. And there are passages in the Republic and elsewhere that have troubled people because they seem to kind of acknowledge this. And Republic 3 famously kind of has a very limited idea of mimesis, which is that it's only when poets pretend to be characters. This is, of course, theater and epic, right? When poets pretend as the speaker to be somebody else, they're deceiving people. But otherwise, it's more straightforward. This is diegetic poetry, for example, is just kind of straightforward. So there's a back and forth here, but the basic idea is, and Laws kind of clarifies this to a later dialogue, right? The basic idea is art is powerful precisely because it's an imitation in two different directions. It both taps into the fact that the world is an imitation, that the whole of creation kind of expresses something profound and deep and abstract, and that it's an imitation from one person to another that conveys the inner human experience. And the connection between those two things is the fact that our souls themselves are a microcosm of the universe. Now, we've talked about a lot of this in a Christian context, actually, the idea that the heavens declare the glory of God, or sacramentalism is a word that I've used for it in the past. But so this is why I think that mimesis is such a powerful tool, right? Is that it actually does kind of get to the bottom of something that is really central to absolutely everything. And in fact, to the whole structure of creation. And if you are a Christian, if you're a Trinitarian, you believe that act of self-expression and of expression to others is at the heart of the Godhead, right? The Trinitarian theology tells us that, the Father, which is beyond, who is beyond all human thought or utterance, or, eye has not seen, ear has not heard what God has ready for those who love him. Nevertheless, he has managed by the power of the second person of the Trinity to incarnate himself and to not only, live and walk among us as a human being, but to express his glory and to paint his glory all across the skies and to embody it in all of creation. And so that's kind of the Christian sacramentalist version of something like the mimetic theory that comes out of Timaeus, and that then gets picked up in a kind of more pedestrian way by Aristotle. Now, Aristotle has been tremendously influential. I mean, it's sort of staggering how many people have taken the idea of mimesis that's presented in Aristotle and used it basically to understand all kinds of human life. So there are a million different examples of this that we could pick up. Dorothy L. Sayers has an essay about detective fiction and Aristotle. In an earlier era, in the 1500s, Philip Sidney, who was a poet in his own right, composed this essay, which was profoundly influential in the Elizabethan era, which, remember, was also Shakespeare's era, right? The Defense of Poesy. And this, too, is, because it's the Renaissance, classical learning is suddenly coming back into vogue and being picked up in a big way. And Defense of Poesy is sort of shot through with this Aristotelian notion. And so I'm going to read now a portion of that I haven't read quite all this before. So he says, let those things alone and go to, let the other things that I've been talking about alone and go to man, for whom as the other things are, so it seems in him her uttermost cunning is employed, nature's uttermost cunning is employed, and know whether she have brought forth so true a lover as Theagenes, so constant a friend as Pylades, so valiant a man as Orlando, so right a prince as Xenophon's Cyrus, so excellent a man every way as Virgil's Aeneas. Neither let this be jestingly conceived, because the works of the one be essential, the other in imitation or fiction. He's saying, and we've talked about this before, that poetry kind of purifies the works of nature into these distilled versions. And he says, neither let's it be jestingly conceived, because the works of the one be essential, the other in imitation or fiction. And imitation has this capacity of kind of drawing out the essence of what we experience in our friends, in our lovers, and in our human relationships. For any understanding knows the skill of each artificer stands in that idea or foreconceit of the work, and not in the work itself. So in some ways, this is a bit of an argument against that Republic 10 passage, which says that this is just a copy of a copy, right? He's saying, no, you're actually getting at the underlying thing by enshrining it in this physical matter, right? And that the poet has that idea is manifest by delivering them forth in such excellency as he has imagined them, which delivering forth also is not wholly imaginative, as we are wont to say by them that build castles in the air, but so far substantially it works, not only to make a Cyrus, which had been but a particular excellency, as nature might have done, but to bestow a Cyrus upon the world, to make many Cyruses, if they will learn aright why and how that maker made him. So this is a smart argument. He's saying, he's pulling all these figures from both mythology and history, right? Cyrus is a historical figure, came into king. And he's saying not only do artists, create, they don't actually create the person Cyrus, because nature does that, right? Nature gives birth to this person. He comes into being in reality, but artists extract his essence, essentially, present him on the stage, and then through that kind of mimetic iteration, right? We who see him on the stage are able, if we wish, to kind of reproduce some essence of him in ourselves and to imitate him and to learn, if they will learn aright why and how that maker made him. Neither let it be deemed too saucy a comparison to balance the highest points of man's wit with the efficacy of nature, but rather give right honor to the heavenly maker of that maker, who, having made man to his own likeness, set him beyond and over all the works of that second nature, which in nothing he shows so much as in poetry, when with the force of a divine breath he brings things forth, far surpassing her doings, with no small argument to the incredulous of that first accursed fall of Adam. Since our erected wit makes us know what perfection is, and yet our infected will keeps us from reaching unto it. That could not be a more succinct statement of everything that I've been insisting upon for quite a few episodes recently. I've been harping a lot on this point. But this is a kind of poetic argument for the argument that I've been making, that theory can get us to an insight into what we are meant to be. It's our will that fails, and we don't actually live it out. But, right, this is this very audacious claim that in the production of poetry, we do to the world, in some sense, what God did to reality when he created. And that is, again, what I have been arguing about the kind of sacramentalist version of this, in Greek, mimetic theory, that all creation is an act of expression of the divine character. And in it, man is this little mimetic, image of God. That's where we get this imago Dei. I mean, in Genesis, right? That let us make mankind in our image. And part of our image, a central part of our image, is our creative faculty. And our creative faculty is mimetic because, of course, God has done this thing of imitation, of making this little miniature expression of himself. So I'm just going to finish up this passage from Sidney here, right? Since our erected wit makes us know what perfection is, and yet our infected will keeps us from reaching unto it. But these arguments will by few be understood, and by few are granted. Thus much, I hope, will be given me, that the Greeks, with some probability of reason, gave him the name above all names of learning. So he's basically making a case here for fitting the Greek idea of mimesis into the Orthodox Christian view of man as image of God from Genesis. And I think it's brilliantly done. And I actually basically agree with all of it, right? I mean, this is the argument that I'm making here, that Plato's holistic mimetic theory, which produces something like Aristotle's literary criticism, is also at the heart of all that there is. And there's one last passage that I'll read before I get into some of the kind of crazier implications of this. And this is from Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 2. So Shakespeare himself has something like this when Hamlet is giving instructions to the actors whom he hires to basically catch out his father's murderer. He says to them, "Suit the action to the word to the action. With this special observance, o'erstep not the modesty of nature. For anything so overdone is from the purpose of playing, whose end both at the first and now was and is to hold, as 'twere, the mirror up to nature, to show virtue her own feature, scorn her own image, and the very age and body of the time his form and pressure." So this is basically it. I mean, it's expressed from a particular point of view of a certain character, and so it's slightly different. But this idea that what we are doing in art is what we are made to do because it is what we are, right? By our nature, it is how we operate, and it's how we operate at a level that goes beyond just surviving and living. It's the thing that we do kind of out of the abundance of our creativity, out of our, albeit corrupted divine nature, right? Let us talk about some of the things that this explains beyond art, because this is where it gets, in my view, really trippy and kind of fun. So it's been used, this idea of mimesis has been used in all sorts of ways. For example, it is also at the root of the word meme. So this same word, mimeomai, also has a variant, mimēma, which is a noun meaning the object of mimesis, the thing that is imitated, right? And so that's where we get the word meme. And in the case of memes, it's something that you pick up and you play with again and again. You kind of pass from hand to hand, and it shifts, it mutates a little bit each time, kind of like a gene. And in fact, it comes from a geneticist, Richard Dawkins, who in The Selfish Gene, which is a book from 1976, right? He basically argues that evolution is not just generated by these physical mutations in human genomic patterns, but also by sort of social behavior, which catches on and is passed on from generation to generation and can move from place to place. And the funny thing about memes on the internet is if you watch them, they do exactly this. They are picked up, they kind of enter the bloodstream at a certain point, and if you watch them, you see that they're kind of expressing something in what the German word for it is Zeitgeist, in the experience of the world, right? Or the sort of general sentiment of the world, let's say. They're expressing something in the zeitgeist, they kind of ripple across the internet, they change as they go. And so, it sounds frivolous to be talking about memes, but they are just another version of us doing mimesis, doing what we do as human beings. And it's part of us, it's part of our creativity, and it's expressive of something. So they're worth watching, right? So like recently, for example, the men should go to therapy meme came back up. And it's like, if you get down to it, right, this is about hostility to men, right? This is not just men should go to therapy because everyone should go to therapy and it will heal them. It's like, men should go to therapy instead of going to the gym, and instead of starting podcasts, actually was one of them. So here am I not going to therapy and instead doing a podcast, and I repent for my toxic masculinity. But in any case, the point here is simply that there are things about the culture expressed in memes because they are us doing what we do as cultural beings. They are us just replicating and reproducing and changing. And of course, this is a bit flippant, but only a little, right? Like, epic, the tradition of epic is like a meme tradition, right? It's like Homer produces a thing and then Virgil picks it up and self-consciously plays with it. Dante picks that up, right? The same behavior, essentially, but over many, many centuries and at a much higher level, I think, of artistry. But so that's one example, right, of the power, the explanatory power of the concept of mimesis. Another one is one that, again, people who, like this sort of thing know a ton about René Girard, but other people who would have no reason to are not super into him. And he's been a little bit forgotten, but he's a wonderful writer, 20th century writer mostly. He died in 2015. But he had a mimetic theory. This is when people talk about mimetic theory, they're usually talking about Girard. And his theory is a theory of desire. And it leads us eventually to an account of why Christ's sacrifice answers a fundamental human problem. So a good way to kind of get a handle on this is this essay that or this paper really that Girard delivered called Generative Scapegoating. And it's in a book called Violent Origins from 1987. And so this paper rather, is essentially a study in comparative mythology. And remember I mentioned Fraser in a previous episode, who kind of inaugurates this obsession with comparing different myths from different cultures and bundling them all up together and saying that, these represent these sort of psychological impulses. And Joseph Campbell is another person who does something similar, but this behavior kind of falls out of fashion when people think of it as too simplistic, or in some cases even like imperialist or whatever. But Girard basically says, well, there are flaws in Fraser, as I think he's right to say, but when we see a trend and a pattern that persists in all of literary culture, in all of historical culture, all of this stuff, right? When we see something happen again and again, we do have a right to ask kind of what is going on here. And he makes this point that basically there are scapegoat myths, and scapegoat is a term that comes from the Bible, from the tradition of the Jewish people, the ancient Jewish people, of basically putting the sins of the people onto a goat and sending it out into the forest, right? That's the scapegoat. But the idea of scapegoatness is then kind of applied outward to all these other myths. Oedipus is an example that Girard uses, who is somebody that comes in and the plague hits, and then it's basically blamed on him sleeping on a curse because he's been sleeping with his mother without knowing. And he makes all of these points in this essay, which you should go away and read, because we won't cover kind of all of his theory of scapegoating. But one thing he notes crucially is that, and I'll read this passage right, he says, a non-conscious scapegoat genesis can never appear explicitly and unambiguously in the myth that would result from it. If it did, it would not be effective. It would not be the real genesis of the text. There is nothing esoteric or mystical about this impossibility. Unjust persecutors will never picture themselves as unjust persecutors, but they will always think and act as unjust persecutors. They will always see their victims, themselves, and their actions in the same stereotyped manner. He says nobody knows he's scapegoating, right? Nobody knows that he's inventing a thing to try and shunt off this, for example, plague that has completely different reasoning behind it, right? To shunt it off onto this other person who, didn't do anything wrong and basically doesn't deserve to have it taken out on him. But why? Why do we do this? And this is where mimetic theory comes in. So he says in the discussion after this paper, he says, for modern students of desire, the main question has been, what is the true object of human desire? To Freud, for instance, our true object is always our mother. From the mimetic standpoint, this makes no sense. Desire can be defined neither by its object, nor by some disposition of the subject. Man is the creature who does not know what to desire, and he turns to others in order to make up his mind. We desire what others desire because we imitate their desires. Now, I will say outright that I think Girard goes too far here, but I do think he's identifying something crucially important, which is there is a mimetic character to desire, just like there's a mimetic character to all of our behavior, I think. We see somebody want something and we want it more, even if we only kind of wanted it a little before. Now I want the thing because you want it. And Girard basically suggests that there's like a perpetual escalation, right, of that desire, of rivalry over a woman, let's say, or over a plot of land. And eventually it becomes not about the object of desire, but of just the people, the competitors themselves, that his rivalry is too much the rule, as Girard says, especially among the males of our species, to be always ascribable to scarcity or to the fortuitous convergence on the same object of two or more desires that arise independently of one another. This, I think, is true, right? The constant crisscrossing of desires must result from the type of imitation that great writers describe, especially in comedies and tragedies. since men are unyielding in their rivalries, their symbolic cultures certainly did not originate in the gentlemanly social contract cooked up by 18th century theorists. The Levi Strauss is referring here to another academic, right? Levi Strauss has revived once again this absurd idea, blithely suggesting that one fine day, pre-human groupings decided, after some kind of constitutional referendum, no doubt, that cultural differentiations, language, and other cultural institutions would be nice things to have. The real solution, Girard argues, to the problem must lie in the very unyielding intensity of mimetic rivalry. It must lie in the murderous violence itself. To be intellectually satisfying, this solution should involve no factors extraneous to the mimetic crisis, as it was defined earlier. It should not depend on dragging some deus ex machina upon our scene of mimetic escalation. It must be purely mimetic, therefore. The scapegoat or unanimous victimage hypothesis satisfies this requirement. When mimetic violence permeates an entire group and reaches a climactic intensity, it generates a form of collective victimage that tends toward unanimity precisely because of the participants' heightened mimetic susceptibility. Now, to put this in plain terms, right, he's describing wokeness. He's describing identitarian politics, which basically consists of desire for power, desire for recognition, and principally, most importantly, desire for virtue, desire to be good, right? Shared among people who compete to outdo one another. And the only way to stop that competition from destroying the group is to turn outward to some imagined offender and to be seeking somebody that we can blame for our problems, which, if that doesn't describe to you some of the stuff that we've seen in our streets, then you're not paying close enough attention, right? I mean, this is the idea that the scapegoat basically absolves you of the concern of having to hash these things out internally, gives you an external enemy, you unite against him, you take out all your grief on him, and then you basically achieve some sort of resolution. Now, this is a never-ending pattern, as also we have seen. Recently, I found an article headlined, "Straight Black Men Are the White People of Black People." That is a real headline. I'm not making that up. And the idea there, of course, is that within this smaller group now of virtuous people, namely Black people, we need to identify the oppressors, right? And this will go on indefinitely because scapegoating in this way is infinitely mimetic. It's infinitely iterative, and it just keeps happening again and again and again. And this was something that Girard himself would have argued, right? This is why the story of the Crucifixion is the most world-changing story, right? Because it says basically, yeah, like this is a thing that humans do. They desire and in a way that basically eats them alive. And then they turn outward and they try to destroy something. And the only way to stop it is for that person to basically just take it. And that's what Jesus does. He deserves absolutely, he's the only person ever alive, in the Bible and in reality who deserved no attack, no scapegoating, and yet took all of it upon himself. And that's the end of it, right? He's the final victim. And the fact that he kind of comes back to life is this idea that, like, well, after you've done that, then what happens, right? And this is the other thing that I want to kind of finish up here with, right? Is like, well, okay, so if you're not just endlessly trying to compete with other people, if you're not in this cycle of scapegoating violence, if you've so indulged in that you've literally killed the Son of God, and then he's come back to life, what's your new life look like, right? And this is where we get at this question, right? Is like, if you're an imitative being, if you're a mimetic being, are you just imitating other people, and are those people just imitating other people forever and forever and forever? Well, that's an insane-making thing, right? And that is why we have this desire for self-determination. We keep talking about, creating ourselves or choosing our own being, our own selfhood. I think that, obsession with just like endless redefinition of gender is part of this, right? That I'm going to decide who I am. But it doesn't work because we are mimetic beings. I saw an Instagram post recently about working out. And look, I'm all for working out, but it was this sculpture of like super jacked guy carving himself out of the body of an overweight guy. So this image, this metaphor, it's a powerful image for getting yourself in shape, which again I'm in favor of. But the caption underneath it was "create yourself," right? Create yourself, and that's what infinite mimesis does for you. This is this idea, if you do not have something that you are that you are imitating, some ground, some stable thing, then you're either just in this infinite loop of imitation, or you do the crazy thing that we're now doing, which is trying to just define ourselves in the abstract, not be defined by anything else. Instead of that, right, the argument is that there's got to be something stable at the basis, at the bedrock of being, which we are all imitating, of which we are, in fact, intended to be mimesis. We are meant to be mimesis. So either it's just memes all the way down, right? Which is kind of the situation that we currently find ourselves in, right? We set out to totally self-determine, and we just find ourselves like imitating one another and competing mimetically and scapegoating forever, and all these dynamics that I've talked about today, right? Or we look for a stable ground of our being. And so weirdly, the Christian argument, and even just the theist argument, I mean, I'm not even quite saying that it's the Christian church specifically here so much as theism that has the answer to this problem, right? It's one of the reasons why the world makes more sense with theism than that, is because once you recognize that we are mimetic beings, it's like, what are we imitating, right? What are we seeking to make ourselves like? And the traditional answer is to make ourselves like God, who made us to be like him. And so that makes mimesis makes sense, which one hopes it will do since it's the whole universe, as I've been arguing. Okay, I hope you found this interesting. I love this stuff, and we'll do more on mimesis because it's just, for me, it's very energizing. But let's do the mailbag. Mailbag questions come to me on Twitter, and this one was direct messaged to me, so I'm not going to say who it was, but I found this very, very interesting, and I would like to answer. I have a question. In your most recent episode about Machiavelli, so this was asked a while back, right after the Machiavelli episode, you suggested that virtu was courage, the willingness and discipline to do great things, and that virtu could be used for good or for bad. This is this Italian word which translates in some sense the Latin word virtus, manliness, which also it means virtue. Doesn't the moral law cover what virtu should and should not be used for? Meaning, isn't virtu governed by an absolute moral law itself, and therefore cannot be praised if it's used for bad, only when it's used for good? Now, this is very, very astute and allows me to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is the different meanings of excellence and the different meanings of virtue. So to recap, right, from the Machiavelli episode, we begin with this Greek word, arete, which means excellence. And especially before Aristotle, arete can be in anything. You can have arete in running, right? And you can be an excellent runner. You can have arete in boxing. You can have arete in weaving, right? But Aristotle says that he's interested, especially in the Nicomachean Ethics, right, in what it means to be good at being human, and what is it essentially to be human, and then what is it then to be good at that thing, right? And eudaimonia is kind of the flourishing, the achievement of that telos. And central to that for Aristotle are the ethical virtues. So these are ethike, having to do with ethos or character. The ethical virtues are a specific subset of arete, of excellences. And so now we have these two concepts. We have ethics and morality, right, which have to do with being good at being human. And we have excellence, which encompasses a whole range of other things. And this questioner is pointing out that, so what I was arguing is that virtu is actually kind of sprawls over that whole field. It doesn't just include moral intuitions, although it does include moral intuitions, but it also includes these kind of morally neutral things like courage and manliness and daring. It's not quite right as the question implies that I said virtu was courage. I'm saying it includes those things, and courage is kind of essential to it because it enables you to act on your virtuous impulses. But yeah, it includes all of these kind of strong, forceful, manly energies, which are excellences, even if they are not moral or ethical excellences. Now, the questioner rightly says, fine, but the use of of all excellences, the employment to which you put them, is governed by a moral law, an objective moral law. I agree with this. And so he says, isn't it the case that we can only praise it when it's used for good? And I am pointing out that the praise in the absolute sense, meaning say that this is a good thing, yes, absolutely. I agree with you. All I'm saying is that we're blinding ourselves if we try to argue that there isn't something admirable and impressive about virtue, full stop, all excellence. is impressive. And if we try to condemn it as not impressive, then we'll lose. We'll lose the argument because it manifestly is impressive. The point here is to argue that even if something is impressive, its use for the wrong ends is evil, as the questioner says. So yes, we are condemning something, but it's a moral condemnation applied to virtues that may themselves be amoral. It's very difficult to decouple our idea of virtue from our idea of ethics because we've so combined them post-Aristotle. But in fact, right, there are excellences which can be used in moral and immoral ways. And yeah, we praise them when they are used morally, and we blame them when they are not used morally. But we shouldn't lie to ourselves about the existence of them as excellences per se. That would be my argument. Great question. These questions, you all send me such stimulating questions, so thank you for that. And thank you for listening. If you like this show, you will love the Claremont Institute. I work there, and we do good stuff. So check it out. The Claremont Review of Books, The American Mind. These are our 2 publications. They are about the American ideals. We are avowedly conservatives. And you can donate to us at claremont.org/donate. Let them know in the notes that we sent you. And we will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.